All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone's grabbed a slice of pizza, had a chance to settle in. For summer honor students in the room, hopefully you enjoyed class. For those of you that had career sessions, hopefully those went well. And for all our guests here today from the Hertog Foundation, AEI interns, young alumni, and SHA alumni, my name's Luis Perales. I'm an academic programs assistant here at AEI. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to our 2019 AEI Summer Honors Academy debate. It's our second annual debate. And tonight I basically have the easy job. The real highlight of tonight and the people doing the real heavy lifting are 10 incredible, thoughtful, talented Summer Honors Academy students who will be debating two resolutions, one on domestic policy, one on foreign policy. But before turning things over to them, I just want to give you all some context for this debate, as well as lay out the rules for it. So for context, each year AEI brings around 230 students from across the country and across the ideological spectrum to spend a week here in the AEI Summer Honors program. It's a rigorous selection process, and of those 230 students, 10 exceptional students participate in our 4-week-long Summer Honors Academy. They've studied topics ranging from constitutional law, K-12 education, Middle East policy. They've gotten to participate in a variety of additional meetings, and they get to participate in workshops like this one. Which, among other things, is a chance to highlight a key value that AEI holds, and that's a commitment to intellectual diversity, civil dialogue, and a robust competition of ideas. And I am really excited to see you, that you are all going to get to see that displayed in tonight's debate. So, here are the ground rules. The two debates that we hear tonight are modeled after the Intelligence Squared debates and are centered around two particular resolutions. We'll begin with 20 minutes of opening statements, and hear remarks arguing for and against the resolution. After that, we'll move on to 10 minutes of moderated conversations, and then continue to 10 minutes of cross-examination, where each side will get to ask questions from the other. After a brief moment, each debater will present 2 minutes of closing remarks. One crucial thing to note is that the winner of each debate will be decided not by who has the most votes at the end of the debate, but by which team has the most gains in support from all of you, the audience. And in order to gauge that, I'm going to ask that you all take a moment to vote on our first resolution tonight, which is the following. Populism, in both its left-wing and right-wing iterations, is a helpful corrective to contemporary American liberalism and conservatism. So this is our domestic policy resolution, and you'll see that there's a link up on the screen from SurveyMonkey. If at this point you could all pull out your phones, follow that link, and go ahead and vote on whether you're for, against the resolution, or undecided about the resolution. All right, it seems like most of you have voted. I'll keep the link up for a couple of minutes, but I want to go ahead and introduce our first moderator for the evening, who will be keeping us on track for the first half of this debate, and who will introduce our first debaters. So at the center of the stage, Alexa King is a recent graduate of New York University and lives in Brooklyn, New York. So please join me in welcoming Alexa and our first debaters.
All right. Hello, everybody. We are very excited to be here. I'm going to start by introducing our debaters on the pro side of the argument. To my far right, we have Richard Hamrick, who recently graduated from Vanderbilt University. And then we have Nate Hochman, who is a rising junior at Colorado College. On the disagree side of the debate, we have Kavya Bana, who recently graduated from the University of Rochester, and Ben Rolsma, who is a rising senior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So if we can get things started by turning to Richard, who will begin with his opening statement.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexa. So tonight, my partner and I are here to make the case that populism serves as a helpful corrective force in American politics. First, I'm going to define what populism is. Then I'm going to walk through several historical examples that illustrate just how invaluable left and right-wing populism can be in winning beneficial policy changes. My partner will speak later about why populism is more important to the American experiment now than ever before. I would like to start out by acknowledging that when someone says the word populism, there are many different people or ideas that can pop into your head, like President Trump or Bernie Sanders. Populism is more than this simple dichotomy, however, and neither of these modern political figures speak for every American disillusioned with today's politics. So first, let's define what populism is and what it isn't. According to Harvard's Weatherhead Center, populism in America can generally be defined as a political or discursive movement centered around the average citizen, one who feels that their concerns are being disregarded by an out-of-touch political or economic elite. Populists identify the ignored concerns of the ordinary people and work to create policy change fueled by their belief in democratic control of the state. When Americans feel that they are being taken advantage of by corporate interests, that their institutions are failing them, or that they are being treated unfairly by government policies, populist movements create channels for expressions of grievance and platforms for change. To be clear, we are not arguing that every populist or populist movement is a good one, only that populism serves as a helpful corrective because it questions the status quo. Populists stretch the limits of American discourse, challenge orthodoxy, and force policymakers and legislators to refocus their attention. In the words of historian and moralist Christopher Lasch, populism at the core is the authentic voice of democracy. To be clear, populism is not authoritarianism, nationalism, or majoritarianism. It is merely a form of political communication that stresses the importance of the citizen in government. By definition, populism is a corrective force because it helps ensure that our democratically elected representatives consider legislation with their constituencies' interests in mind. So now I'd like to provide a brief historical overview on populism in American history. Our past tells us that populism has been a helpful corrective and has not damaged the American experiment. And I don't think we have any reason to think that this formula has changed in modern times. Henry Olson, a scholar at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, pointed out that America's first enduring political coalition was actually a populist movement. In the late 18th century, many rural farmers were upset by a federally imposed whiskey tax, which, if you paid attention in your U.S. AP history classes, led to the infamous Whiskey Rebellion. Thomas Jefferson and Madison recognized widespread discontent with incumbent political elites and ran to defeat the Federalists John Adams and Alexander Hamilton in the election of 1800. These Republicans provided the first example of a uniquely American populist movement. They cast Americans as honest and hardworking, portrayed Adams and Hamilton as aristocratic public officials supported by the wealthy New England merchant class, which benefited the most from the whiskey tax. Backing Jefferson's Republican vision allowed the people to gain control of their government and were able to obtain economic justice. Ultimately, Jefferson's populism won the repeal of the whiskey taxes and unlocked prosperity for farmers. Both the 19th and 20th centuries featured populist movements winning critical reforms opposed by the elite. It was populism that helped reform the unbelievable concentrations of wealth and political power that emerged during the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age saw railroad and banking conglomerates grow like wildfire, and they benefited from an absence of regulation, which allowed them to price gouge Midwestern farmers. These Midwestern farmers formed populist parties and ultimately were able to win what are called the Granger reforms, which regulated monopoly pricing so they could compete fairly. FDR's New Deal was also populist in nature. Introduced in 1933, the New Deal was specifically designed to end the Great Depression by creating policies to put the average American back to work. FDR's radical economic reforms, like suspension of the gold standard and formalizing a progressive income tax, specifically benefited the working class over the objections of corporate interests. More recently, Reagan's populism united a diverse coalition of Americans who believed bloated and inefficient government served as a large stumbling block to prosperity. Reagan's populist rhetoric was informed by a moderate temperament, a faith in American exceptionalism, and an openness to immigration. He warned that concentrated power could corrode the American experiment and worked to lower taxes and eliminate government overreach. Reagan was able to challenge the preconceived notion that government's elites had that society was too complex to be managed by a self-rule and that government by an elite group was superior. He turned that assumption on its head, asking in his first inaugural, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? Reagan gave power back to the people, opened up the economy, and gave immigrants a chance at a fresh start, demonstrating the power of inclusive populism. American history tells us that populism works as a check against elitism, that populist movements ensure America's legislatures remain in tune with their constituents. My partner and I are not here to defend every populist movement, leader, or cause, but we do believe that populists force conversations that would not happen otherwise. To write populism off as damaging or corrosive is to deny the American citizen the opportunity to band together and express their discontent. In many ways, we believe that denying populism a place in politics is to reject the American tradition altogether. Thank you.
And now we are going to turn to Ben, who will provide the first opening statement for the disagree side.
One of the great philosophers and political theorists of our time, Lucy from the comic strip Peanuts, once said that we must always be able to blame the previous generation for our problems. It doesn't solve anything, but it makes us all feel better. Unhelpful blame placing is an ancient art in political life, and it can actually be very therapeutic. But Kavya and I fear that the recent reemergence of populism on the American political stage, which blames the elite for our problems, isn't just a movement that doesn't solve anything. It's actually a lot more troubling than that. We don't claim that populism can't highlight important, relevant injustices in American society, but we are sure that populism is not a helpful corrective. We'll argue this in three basic parts. In this speech, I'll first offer a brief analysis of the resolution. Second, argue that populism actually undermines democracy. And in my partner's speech, she'll add a third point, that populism drives ineffective policy. So first, a brief analysis of the resolution. The resolution suggests that populism might be a helpful corrective to the right and the left, and the word corrective implies that American democracy has some kind of a path that it should be on, regardless of political ideology. Kavya and I think that this path is, at the very least, a stable, peaceful, representative democracy that upholds life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As a shorthand, we'll just call this democracy. This gives us actually a pretty easy way to judge whether populism is a helpful corrective. It is a helpful corrective if it supports the long-term stability and success of democracy, and it is not a helpful corrective if it does not help the long-term stability and success of democracy, or if it does so in a way that is unnecessarily harmful. At the end of the debate, we'll return to this framework and ask you to judge populism using it. But now that we have a way to judge who should win the round, let's turn to the first main argument. Populism undermines democracy. Populism undermines democracy. Our opponents have offered a definition of populism, which seems about right to us, but we'd like to offer a little bit of a clarification from a great work by the Princeton politics professor Jan Werner, who defined populism as a way of perceiving the political world in a way that sets a morally pure and fully unified people against elites who are deemed corrupt or in some other way morally inferior. Now, you'll see some different points of emphasis in this definition as the one that our opponents offered, but really, at the core, they're pretty similar. Pro says that populism is centered around the American average citizen. The problem, of course, is who is the average American citizen? Jan Werner highlights the dangers of focusing our political rhetoric around the idea of the pure people or the average citizen. This is the tendency that, to one degree or another, ties together all the strains of populism. But for democracy to be stable and peaceful, we need a political landscape where we can, as AEI's own Arthur Brooks says, disagree better, if not necessarily disagree less. Populism makes this really hard because it divides people up into the real or pure people or the average citizen and the exploiting elites. This pushes politics towards polarization, and in this charged atmosphere, populism undermines democratic institutions. Driven on by an urgent need to follow the will of the people, populism tends to be skeptical about working within existing constitutional rules. William Galston, a fellow at Brookings, identifies 4 core characteristics of liberal democracy: Good democracies have popular sovereignty, recognize citizens as equal, have an enduring constitutional framework, and generally recognize the unalienable rights that the Declaration of Independence talks about. Populism likes some of the characteristics of democracy. Notice the emphasis on engagement in the democratic system in the definition that our opponents offered. But it is skeptical of some others. It's skeptical of constitutionalism and minority groups quite frequently. Michael Zuckert, a professor at Notre Dame, suggests something similar when he says that populism is when the people are attempting to exercise governmental power more directly than the system's constitutionalism normally allows. Donald Trump comes uncomfortably close to this when he calls the press the enemy of the people and demands that we open up libel laws. In a time when the American right and left are getting farther apart, populism accuses the opposition of being not just political adversaries, but enemies. They are not the real American citizens. At the same time, populists are skeptical about the institutions that support and sustain democracy. They may be worried about real problems, but the endurance of democracy demands patience, tolerance, and respect for institutions. To echo Lucy, populism doesn't solve anything, and it makes us all feel much, much worse. Thank you.
And now we're going to turn to Nate.
According to a recent Politico survey, the following things are more popular with Americans than our Congress: lice, traffic jams, NFL replacement referees, cockroaches, used car salesmen, colonoscopies, Nickelback. I don't think I need to run through an exhaustive list, but it seems clear that the fact that Americans find invasive surgeries, parasites, and awful Canadian pop rock bands more attractive than our current government suggests that our political system is broken. That might not be particularly apparent to many of us in this room. For the political and cultural elite in this country, life is as good as it has ever been. The American dream is alive and well in the upper one-third of our society. In the gated communities of Greenwich Village, Connecticut, the high-rise apartments in New York's Upper East Side, the billionaire neighborhoods of Silicon Valley, life is pretty good. There's no reason at all to be dissatisfied. Social capital is strong. Business is booming. Your children will probably be even more wealthy and prosperous than you are. People in your community are kind to each other. You trust your neighbors, and you just can't understand why someone would vote for someone like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. But the story for a vast swath of Americans is radically different. According to a recent Harvard study, for typical American male workers, there's been no general rise in wages since the late 1960s, with only short periods of modest improvement. In other words, the typical male today earns less than the typical male did in 1969. A typical son in his 30s makes less today than his father did 30 years ago after inflation. This is, in the words of AEI's own Tim Carney, almost perfectly antithetical to the common understanding of the American dream. But perhaps even more devastatingly, civic and community life is in severe decline for working class communities across America. As we will demonstrate, the little platoons which hold local communities together are disappearing. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that nothing attracted his regard more than the intellectual and moral associations of America. However, for communities across America, those Tocquevillian associations are in decline. Is this the society that we want to live in? This is the question that we must endeavor to answer tonight. What this debate is not about is Donald Trump. At some point, maybe a year, maybe 5, Donald Trump will be gone. The benefactors of the status quo would like to believe that we will return to politics as usual. Those same people would be satisfied to make this entire debate about Trump and the political hysteria of the day. But it would behoove thoughtful, passionate people like the ones in this room to see beyond the talking heads, the tweets, and the general insanity that seems to have momentarily engulfed this city. Make no mistake about it, that insanity and confusion is the product of a political class which has had the foundation of its power shaken to the core by the very source from which that power is supposed to be derived, the American people. Populism is the channeling of the passion of the people towards a productive end, a necessary shaking up of a sluggish status quo, a powerful expression of the country's desire for change. Subsequently, in order to win, our opponents must demonstrate that the current status quo is working for the vast majority of Americans. For if one accepts that populism is the representation of the grievances of the people against those in power, one must accept that those in power are doing an acceptable job in order to vote against tonight's resolution. Mainstream conservatism and progressivism are static. Our political elite are devoid of new ideas. And without populism, without a grassroots insurgence, no one will jolt them out of their complacency and force them to develop new approaches to once again serve the needs of their constituents. Populism is the political manifestation of what Joseph Schumpeter famously referred to as creative destruction. It is not our duty to accept the cultural elitism of the progressive left. Similarly, we have no obligation to sit by and accept the dogmatic defense of corporate power by the libertarian right. We must think deeply and critically about the so-called Washington Consensus, this tacit, unspoken agreement about certain principles shared by the vast majority of the political elite, regardless of partisan sympathy. Many people are concerned about the new populist developments on both the left and the right. Undoubtedly, a plethora of policy proposals which have arisen from those contemporary movements are unrealistic, but they have played an indispensable role in starting a variety of crucially important national conversations which challenge dogma and orthodoxy across the political spectrum. We must have the courage and the humility to admit that our current populist moment is a good thing. It is nothing less than the American people vehemently reasserting their sovereignty. Thank you.
Kavya?
As my partner Ben already mentioned, populism is not a helpful corrective if it damages or does not affect the long-term success of a democracy, or does so in a way that's unnecessarily harmful. Currently, populism does this in two ways. The first is by undermining democratic institutions, which my partner Ben discussed at length. I will demonstrate that populism drives ineffective policy. Populism drives ineffective policy. To begin, I will state the goals of populism and then use examples of modern-day populist policy put forth by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, whom my opposition is quick to dismiss, though they are great examples of populism today. To illustrate that populism creates feudal policy that actually hurts the very same populations with very real concerns. Populism's goal is to ensure that politics should be an expression of the will of the pure people. This sounds like the democracy our founding fathers intended for. Yet populism actually sets up a false conception of who those people are. The pure people don't have to be all of the citizens. This is best exemplified by Trump's quite eloquent comment in May of 2016 that, quote, "The only important thing is the unification of the people because the other people don't mean anything," unquote. Clearly, populism is divisive, but to what end? Populism creates an imagined sense of extreme urgency that the people need to act on a problem now, before it's too late. As a result, according to Jan Werner Müller, quote, "Populist policies justified with reference to the people really can turn out to have been irresponsible. Those deciding on such policies did not think hard enough. They failed to gather all the relevant evidence, or most plausibly, their knowledge of the likely long-term consequences should have made them refrain from policies with only short-term electoral benefits for themselves," unquote. Basically, long-term consequences are largely ignored by populist voters and politicians alike in favor of short-term perceived gains. As aforementioned, I will now provide two specific examples of how modern-day populists create inadequate policy. This brings us to one of the most adored populists of our time, Donald Trump. One of Trump's campaign promises was that he would build a wall to stave off illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Trump created a rhetoric of the working class people versus immigrants and fabricated a crisis around Mexican illegal immigrants stealing the jobs of white working class people. His wall would purportedly solve that crisis. Yet, the wall is completely ineffective in actually aiding border control. According to David Beer of the Cato Institute, it is both too expensive and ineffective as it lacks opacity. Trump's wall is simply a symbol, not an effective policy. It creates an us versus them. So while populism claims to speak for all of the people, inherently it is divisive. Moreover, Trump did not just rail against illegal immigrants, but also the wealthy elite. Quite ironic, considering he is one of them. While in office, he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which helped the wealthiest 2% of Americans by giving them 8 times more tax cuts than the bottom 20% of Americans, according to the Tax Policy Organization. Trump's policies typify the short-term thinking of populist politicians. Due to the fact that Trump created an urgent crisis around illegal immigration, he proposed a solution that was short-sighted and ignored very real concerns about drug trafficking and immigrants overstaying their visas. This short-sightedness is characteristic of populism and drives ineffective policy. Similarly, while on the right we had Trump, on the left we had Bernie Sanders. Sanders' free college proposal, as popular as it may sound, especially to those of us students in the room right now, would actually lower the quality of higher education and cut out even more low-income and disadvantaged students than it does now. Andrew Kelly, a former AEI scholar, discusses the issues with Sanders' free college plan as such. Free college simply shifts the cost of college from students to taxpayers, causing enrollments to increase and costs to rise. As costs rise, colleges will be faced with the choice to decrease admission or cut quality, putting them between a rock and a hard place. Furthermore, the limited spots that would be available would be taken up by the very same elites that the populists stand divided against. Sanders' plan claims to help low-income disadvantaged students without access to higher education. But college cost is not the main problem for these students. A lack of a quality K-12 education, which leaves them unprepared for college, is. Free college provides no solution to the actual problems, but it does appeal to the ears of the masses of people. Both Sanders and Trump, the populists of our time, created a false sense of crisis around issues of immigration and higher education that led to policy that accomplishes neither their own goals nor the goals of the pure people that they claim to serve. The populism of today is short-sighted, ineffective in its policy, divisive in its rhetoric, and is not a helpful corrective to the American democratic project. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to turn to 10 minutes of moderator questions. If you can keep your responses to 2 minutes, that would be great. So I'm going to open up with a question that I have for both of you, and if the pro side wants to take it first, and then the against side can respond. So President Trump, whom you both talked about, ran as a populist, but I think we can all agree that he is governing not as a populist. So how do your respective arguments address candidates who use populist rhetoric to achieve office, but then don't govern as populists?
I'm not to answer the question with a question, but I'm curious to ask how you would say that he's not governing as a populist.
The tax bill, for example.
Yeah, so I think this is sort of, and you heard this in Kavya's opening remarks a lot, was criticism of specific proposals. The resolution that we're debating tonight has nothing to do with particular proposals or even particular political figures. What we're talking about is the shaking up of the status quo through the introduction of new ideas to the debate. So what it should take in order for you to make your decision about the resolution tonight isn't whether or not you feel favorably or negatively towards either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or either of the proposals. It's about whether or not you think this particular phenomenon is a good thing for the conversation that we're having as a country or not. So regardless of whether Donald Trump is governing as a populist, I think is largely irrelevant to whether or not the resolution is correct.
And one thing I would want to jump in on very briefly. Y'all did mention sort of the wall and also free education on the Sanders side. Again, we're not here to defend specific policies, but the funding for the wall has not been secured as a result of Congress and our constitutional system. Free college has also not happened as a result of our constitutional system. But what both of those things have done is jumpstart critically important conversations about affordability in higher education, as well as the importance of reforming immigration. And so while they might seem acerbic or caustic, we are talking about this tonight, which I think in many ways is the end of itself.
And this is fundamentally what the resolution is about. It's easy to get sucked into an evaluation about Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or a referendum on all of their policies. What the resolution is about tonight and the decision that you will be making is whether or not the discussions that have happened as a result of them have been beneficial for our country or not.
Your response?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that our opponents don't really want us to be talking about the specific proposals that populists make. And I think it's pretty clear why they don't really want to talk about those things, because most of the time they're pretty indefensible because they're bad ideas, they just don't work, etc. our point in talking about these specific policy proposals is to highlight not necessarily those specific policy proposals, but the fact that the structure and character of populism inevitably and essentially always leads to those kinds of policy proposals. So, in sort of reasoned, thoughtful political discourse, you don't have people running around saying we should literally build a wall along every foot of the Mexican border. Even if that might be a reasonable policy solution at some points along the way, that kind of dramatic rhetoric is exactly the sort of thing that you get out of populists. And when you have that kind of divide between whoever it is that's the real people and whoever it is that's the elite, you have these kinds of problems where you have a lack of patience and thoughtfulness and willing to engage within the pre-established ancient political constitutional institutions that are the way that democracy is supposed to work. It's also worth pointing out that, sort of in reference to your question, that populists running and then not really governing as populists, as Kavya highlighted, that's also just the sort of thing that you would expect with populists, because they propose policies that can't actually be put into practice. And there's a couple bad things that come from that. One of the bad consequences is that then you have a lot of politicians spending a lot of time talking about things that are never actually going to happen. The second is a longer term and more damaging effect of populist rhetoric. When Donald Trump promises a wall along the border, Bernie Sanders promises free college, people take those proposals seriously, even though they're not actually going to be put into practice. And so when politicians go to Washington and they don't do anything like what they promised, it results in long-term damage to the trust that Americans have in political institutions. And that is another example of the way that populism, in this pretty insidious way, tends to undermine the way that democracy works in America.
So based off what you just said, and Richard kind of started getting at this, so your claim about populism driving ineffective legislation, but as Richard said, we are having a conversation about immigration and education and healthcare and what we should do with all of this that is largely driven by populists. And I'm just wondering why you believe that conversation might be harmful to democracy.
So, democracy already has built-in ways to address populist concerns. Examples of popular movements in history that addressed issues that the elites validly did ignore didn't display the same damaging traits of populism we see today. So if we look back at the civil rights movement, there were sects of the civil rights movement that were populist in nature, but they still did not undermine the constitutional framework that we were working in and did not use the authoritarian language that populism of today has been using. And if we look at the LGBTQ rights movement, it didn't require splitting people up into the elites and the others. Though there were parts of these movements that were populist, these movements largely used popular concern around themselves to bring themselves to light. Democracy still addresses concerns of people that are largely ignored via popular movements and organizing around them and rallying without using the damaging, harmful ways of populism that undermines democracy.
I mean, if you read the speeches of Martin Luther King, his speeches are characterized by focusing on the things that bring us together as Americans, not on the fact that there are the average American citizens and the elites who are screwing over the average American citizens. And that's a big part of why the civil rights movement was so effective.
And now for you all,
Can I just respond to that briefly?
very quickly.
I think Kavya made my point for me. She admitted all these beneficial movements in the past had populist elements or were populist in nature and had outcomes which she admitted were beneficial. And somehow she thinks that, or our opponents claim that the populist movements or populism as a whole would be radically different now than it would be then. Populism is not Donald Trump. It's not Bernie Sanders. It's a phenomenon which has occurred in the past to great beneficial effect for ordinary Americans of different stripes and colors, and there is no reason to expect it would be different now than it was then. It's not a referendum on Bernie Sanders, on Donald Trump. It's a phenomenon that has occurred in American life in the past and continues to occur to beneficial effect today.
Actually, am I allowed to respond to that point?
Also very quickly.
Populism today is quite different from populism of the past. Populism of the past, as I just said, worked in the constitutional framework. If you look at the radical left movements today, they're calling for a complete destruction of the Constitution and starting over, a complete destruction of institutions. This is very different from the populism of the past.
There have been calls
wait,
for destruction of the Constitution in movement since the Constitution existed. The Constitution still stands.
So, off of that, how do you ensure that populist leaders are working inside of the constitutional framework? So you argue that, populist movements have happened, they haven't hurt democracy, America is still doing okay. But how do we ensure that our institutions don't erode over time, as some of the leftist movements of today are arguing for?
I think that's a great question. So I guess one thing I would point to is, I think being engaged citizens and sort of participating in our, democratically elected republic basically does ensure that sort of these institutions aren't, damaging or corrosive. So I guess what I would say to that is, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, there have been populist movements throughout history, no doubt, that were temporarily, insidious or were, loud and vocal. But over time, they, really formed helpful correctives and really addressed critically ignored problems. And so I think, in the short term, it is very easy and perhaps simplistic to say that things are, damaging democracy and corroding democracy. And it is easy to say that Trump is attacking the press and Bernie Sanders' policy ideas are bad. But I think the first thing I would say is, number one, Bernie Sanders uses incredibly inclusive language, rhetoric, et cetera, to really draw in these broad coalitions. And I think the second thing I would say is, by and large throughout the Trump presidency, no matter what your sort of opinion of him as a leader is, the institutions have held, certain policies and procedures in check, and the institutions have held. And so I think it is a little premature and perhaps alarmist to say that the institutions are corroding rapidly or need to be actively maintained. I think if we do our jobs as citizens and show up to the ballot box, I think everything will turn out just fine, like it has for the past 200, 300 years.
The exceptional beauty of the American constitutional system is its ability to withstand the excesses of democracy. So to our opponents who are claiming that now, which is different somehow from every other moment in American political history, now the Constitution and our constitutional order is really in danger, I would ask them, when has that been the case in the past? When has our Constitution corroded as a result of previous populist movements?
You have 15 seconds if you want to take that.
I'd encourage everyone to read Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address. It talks about the run-up to the Civil War. It's really relevant to a lot of populist discussions. There's a lot more violence going on then, but it's exactly the kind of rhetoric and situation that precedes the problems that can come from populism.
I don't think anyone in this room laments the Civil War.
Okay, we're going to turn to a little cross-examination. So Nate and Richard won a coin toss earlier, so they get to ask a question of the against side. The against side responds, and then they will have an opportunity to respond to that. We're going to also try to keep our comments to 1 to 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Sounds good. So Ben and Kavya, y'all both talked about ensuring that we sort of perpetuate the stable, peaceful, representative democracy. That's something I think we can all agree on, no matter where we come from. One thing I would say is, saying that doesn't ensure that every group is heard and everyone has a voice at the table and everyone is equally represented in that democracy. And so I guess my question to you is, what sort of do you see as the alternative to populist-like movements in generating change and in really catching the attention of policymakers who often are disengaged with certain segments of the population that have been ignored or hurt or don't have a seat at that table? I guess what do you think the alternative would be?
Well, I think that there's a reason for why we have the term populism, and that distinguishes a lot of politics from just regular democratic politics, because populism is something that's different from the way that democracy works a lot of the rest of the time. And there are a number of opportunities that you can find in the history of American political life where there have been significant changes made that address problems in American society. Kavya talked about 2 of them, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. Both of those addressed really serious concerns that people had about the way that American life was being lived out. And the ways in which those movements were successful insofar as their leaders used rhetoric that focused on what brought us together and not what made us separate. What populists do, and the reason for why we have this separate term to use to describe that particular kind of working within democracy is because, as Jan van Mueller highlights, populists focus on this kind of division between whoever it is that they happen to believe are the real people and whoever it is that they happen to believe are the elites. We just don't believe that we need to do democracy that way. You can use populism within the democratic system, but there are ample examples, including the ones that we've talked about, for where democracy worked the way that it was supposed to. We don't have to turn to the divisive rhetoric of populism in order to solve those problems. We're asking the American people to turn to the better angles of their nature, to focus on what brings us together and use that to solve our problems, rather than focusing on what separates us, which is why we have a special term, populism, to describe that kind of politics.
Yeah, so I think my response to that would be there certainly are, a ton of examples, as you mentioned, in American history where the process works great, we arrive at a fantastic policy and it works out. I would say I cited some in my speech. I could cite more, but I won't bore you all with a history lesson. There are tons of examples in American history where, sort of participating in that quote-unquote traditional process doesn't win change, doesn't win approval, and that through populism and its rhetoric and its discursive ability, change was ultimately able to be won, and change that was good, lasting, and enduring in the American Republic. I would also point out that I think it was a little bit contradictory when you sort of are talking about, the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement as being populist and using inclusive language. We agree that populism uses inclusive language, and I don't think that has changed today. I think there are certainly populists today that do not necessarily always use inclusive language, but there certainly are populists today that use inclusive language. And, by and large, you can't junk the entire phenomenon just because there's a few people you don't like. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with the fact that Bernie Sanders is a pretty inclusive guy, whether you agree with that inclusion or not. So that would be my response.
Populism is inherently not inclusive. It sets up a dichotomy of the pure people versus the elite. And you talked about it yourself when you talked about populism representing the average citizen. But the average citizen is whatever that populist politician wants to say is the average citizen, not necessarily every American citizen.
I've heard this trope a couple times, which is that populism is inherently an exclusive ideology, and I think it's actually the reverse. Populism is inherently an inclusive ideology, because what it is saying is the people who I am representing, their voice is not being heard by the political elite who are supposed to represent them in a democracy. I am going to include them in a dialogue and in the narrative from which they've previously been excluded. It is not, and the definition for populism, which our opponents have given you, which is that it is the pure people versus the elite, it's not completely incorrect, but it's misleading and pejorative, and I think it's incomplete. The definition of populism is that it is the representation of the grievances of the people against those in power who have been withholding representation of the people from the representation of those people from them. So it is not this creation of a false dichotomy between the pure people and the elite. It is an attempt to include the voices of previously marginalized people in the democratic conversation.
Do you all want to jump in and ask them a question or respond?
Just a quick response. I just encourage the audience to kind of run through in your minds the populist movements that come to mind from contemporary politics in particular, and ask yourself, does what characterize them, are they primarily characterized by what the pro team is talking about as sort of the emphasis of their definition, which is a kind of general inclusivity, or does it look a little bit more like what Jan van Mueller is talking about, where you do eventually have to figure out who are the average Americans that populists are talking about? And as Kavya pointed out, it's the populists who decide who that is. And then just the quick question for you is, who is the average American citizen?
Well, it depends on the populist movement. But I would push back. No, that's the entire point. The entire point is populist movements exist at different times for the representation of different people who feel rightly aggrieved and frustrated by the fact they're not represented in the political establishment. So this idea that it's just one group of people who are just upset, or they're drawing a comparison or an exclusive dichotomy between themselves and someone else is simply not true.
So we believe the problem with populism is not that it draws attention to the things that haven't been addressed. The problem is the way that it does that. And so there's recently, you guys are talking about how it unifies people and brings people together, but actually the populism of today has really pushed the political parties apart. Recently, a study was conducted by the Brightline Watch 2018 with professors from Dartmouth College, the University of Rochester, University of Michigan, and University of Chicago. They found that people today are more likely to vote on party lines, regardless of whatever the policy standings of those politicians are. They gave people the choice of two equal candidates, and they switched whether or not they would have traditionally Democratic policies or traditionally Republican policies, and they simply switched the name of the parties, and Democrats were more likely to pick someone who supported Republican policy simply because they were Democrat, and vice versa. And that reflects the hyperpolarization and hyperpartisanship that populism today has caused. And moreover, the Pew Research Center has conducted surveys over 20 years and found that partisanship has risen and polarization has the widest that it has been in 20 years. As my opponents keep talking about how it's not very different today, it is very different today. We have extreme gaps, and it has led to a lot of gridlock in Congress and inability to pass actual legislation.
Yeah, so one thing I would say there, that's a great study. That's a little alarming for our American democracy. I fail to see how populism is the sole cause or even the primary cause of that. It is no doubt that we are very polarized. I think in some ways we are polarized not because of populism, but actually that populism is a manifestation of the polarization. You look at you look at the bizarre coalition that voted for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders in the election. Part of that is people being really dissatisfied and quite frankly polarized over a series of issues. Hearing somebody that's saying, you know what, I'm going to represent your interest and voice, perhaps doing it in a polemic way, but also rallying a significant amount of support. I think it is a little crude and simplistic to say that populism is the sole driver of partisanship in America. We're divided over issues. We are divided over a significant amount of things. We're divided over inequality and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I don't think that sort of populist agitation is the cause of that. I think perhaps it is a symptom of it.
Yeah, look, the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders is not symptomatic of a healthy democracy. So the polarization and the gridlock and the lack of the political establishment to get anything done which helps ordinary Americans, besides yelling at each other on cable television, is exactly why populism has risen. And it has risen in various times throughout American history to respond to equally concerning phenomena in order to fix a lot of issues which were being experienced in America that day. So the idea that populism has caused polarization, I think, doesn't stand up to the facts that you yourself cited, which is that polarization has been happening for the last 20 years in American politics, if not more. And the American people are so fed up with their political elite that they threw their hands up and they said, give me an outsider. Give me someone who talks about something different besides the static, corrosive status quo that we've been witnessing in our politics.
I guess at that point, a relevant question to ask is, what are the limits of populism, if any?
When you say the limits of populism, I mean,
so you talked about that there are bad populists. Who are the bad populists? What makes them bad populists?
You have 15 seconds.
Yeah, that's a long conversation for a different time.
Yes, it is.
We're not arguing that there aren't bad populists. There have been bad populists in history. That doesn't mean that you throw the idea. There have been bad presidents in history. You don't throw the presidency out because there's been a bad president or two along the way.
And that's not what the resolution is about tonight.
All right.
And that's also just not what this is about.
Okay. So now we're going to take a nice 2-minute break. We're going to give our debaters some time to write up their closing statements. And we'll talk to you in 2 minutes.
Just as a quick thing, folks, we'll be taking a longer break after the conclusion of this debate, so if you could all just stay in, because we're going to have the post-vote in just a second. Again, we're having a longer break in a little bit, so please stay in the room. Thanks.
All right, folks. Hello, everybody. Hello, if I could get your attention up here, everybody. All right, we are going to go to our closing statements. We are going to do this in the same order that we started, so if you could all turn your attention to Richard.
Are we on? Okay, there we go. Great, thank you all so much. So to conclude, I really see populism as a tool for folks that feel like they haven't had a voice to engage with political elites and tell them to wake up and sort of enact changes that are really beneficial. In every single century of American history, populism has served as a corrective force that has introduced or implemented policies that were beneficial to broad, previously ignored swaths of society that without populism, I fail to see how exactly they would have won their cause. And it's also worth noting that many folks throughout history have tried through sort of more conventional channels and then ultimately failed in that avenue and sought a different perspective. So I think calling that damaging or corrosive is really unsympathetic and perhaps a little disengaged from the issue at hand. Next, I would point out that populism even more recently has been a broadly inclusive phenomenon that has really channeled the passion of the people into producing beneficial change. Our opponents actually brought up two phenomenal examples of this in the civil rights movement, which used populist language and rhetoric in a discursive style. Same thing goes with the gay rights movement and many other things in the 20th century as well. And also, I'd want to point out one other thing. Populism does not have a monopoly on bad policy proposals. There have been fantastic policy proposals made by populists. There have been bad policy proposals made by the more democratic, the more traditional, however you want to phrase it, politicians. The really critical thing to pay attention to is that populism starts conversations that bring people back to the table. I'd leave you with this. I sort of see populism like a rumble strip on the side of the road. You don't want to drive down a rumble strip for too long because it really sort of shakes your car and is very annoying and loud and bumpy. But boy, you're really glad it's there when you fall asleep at the wheel because it jerks you up and it gets you back on the path where you started. And so I would encourage you to think of populism in that vein. Thank you.
Ben?
The message that I'd like to leave you with is that we don't have to do it this way. We don't have to do it this way. American democracy was set up as an enduring constitutional structure within which the population of American citizens would be able to put into place policies that address their needs and concerns. There is a helpful, thoughtful way to do this, which is normal, everyday democracy, where you respect your opponents and don't see them as your enemies. Populism is an unnecessary departure from the way that democracy can and should work. Our opponents are absolutely right that there are a number of movements that could fairly, to one degree or another, be characterized as populist, that resulted in policy changes that we like, that were good things. Our point is that it doesn't have to be that way. There are also plenty of political movements that were not characterized by that sort of rhetoric. We would like to urge the American people, assuming that they're watching this, which they probably aren't, to address the problems that they're concerned with by using the rhetoric of unity and not the rhetoric of enemies, which is, if you're willing to think about it, what characterizes populists. So if you go back to the way that we asked you to judge the resolution, we ask you to vote, for our side if you agree that populism is not a helpful corrective, if it damages or does not affect the chances of long-term stability and success for democracy, or does so in a way that is unnecessarily harmful. That's what populism is. It is unnecessarily harmful. Civil War, great results. Freed the slaves. It was unnecessarily harmful. We didn't have to do it that way. It ended up that way, but it wasn't that great. Our opponents argued that we have to show that the status quo in America is just fine. We don't think it's fine either. We urge you, though, to address it without using the rhetoric of populism. We should reject populism because of its deeply troubling long-term erosion of institutions, but we should also reject it because it is simply not a virtuous way to engage in democratic politics. We urge you to vote against populism's enemy-making, against its divisive rhetoric, against its chaos, and for a politics of charity, thoughtfulness, and virtue. Thank you.
Nate?
Alexis de Tocqueville once said that the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. And I think that's pretty much true. Americans and the American project has largely been a continual, perpetual quest to repair our faults and make ourselves a more perfect union. But we need democracy in its most vital form in order to shake our elites out of their complacency and revive a sluggish status quo in order to continue this project. Ronald Reagan famously said that freedom is not passed down in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and passed down to our children to do the same. And I think that's also right. But if not populism, then what? If not a populist grassroots insurgence against the complacency of the sluggish status quo, then what else will do that? Because I think most people in this room would agree that what was happening in Washington before 2016 was far from desirable. And in order to vote with our opponents tonight, what you have to say is that that was essentially working for most Americans. Because our opponents have offered no alternative. They've said, Ben said there's a better way. But there was no better way offered. Similarly, Ben said populism is corrosive to democracy. But there's no real convincing case made that populism has ever been corrosive to American democracy in the past. So this is not a referendum on the specific policies of someone like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, as much as our opponents might like to make it that way. What it is a decision about whether or not the conversations that we're having now are good for the country, or if the way that things were before 2016 when our political establishment was out of touch with the American people was better.
And Kavya.
So we've made the argument that populism is not a helpful corrective democracy because of two things. It undermines democratic institutions and it drives ineffective policy. I'd like you guys for a moment to replace the words that Richard used, passion for the people, with mob mentality. One sounds like a really good thing and the other is bad. Populism, Nate keeps interchanging with grassroots insurgents. These two are not the same thing. Grassroots movements like the feminist movement and the civil rights movement and LGBTQ movement the leaders of these movements in the past never showed the disregard for the Constitution that they do today. Two Yale law professors, writing for The Atlantic, discuss the dangers of the unique type of populism present today. Quote, "For its part, the left needs to rethink its scorched earth approach to American history and ideals. Exposing injustice, past and present, is important, but there's a world of difference between saying that America has repeatedly failed to live up to its constitutional principles and saying that those principles are lies. Washington and Jefferson were slave owners. They were also political visionaries who helped give birth to what would become the most inclusive form of governance in world history. This inclusive form of governance that does not set up a dichotomy of people versus elites, that sets up a characterization of the unity of the American people, the American project, is only undermined by populism."
All right, if we can give it up for our debaters.
Thank you guys so much. You're off the hot seat, so if you'd like to take a seat while everyone else will turn your attention to you. So it's time for our post-debate survey. You'll notice the link is back up there, but it's a different question, a different survey, slightly different. So if you could take a moment to vote whether you're for, against, or undecided about the resolution. All right, folks. So I was waiting for a gaffe, and I am completely responsible for it. You'll notice that the text in the survey is different, but you still have the choice to vote for, against, or undecided about the resolution. The correct resolution, of course, is right up on the screen. We haven't been talking about income inequality, so please don't give us your thoughts on that. And please give us your thoughts on this resolution. Thank you. All right, folks, I think everyone's had a chance to vote. Yeah. So before transitioning over to our next panel for the night, I want to go ahead and announce the results for our first panel. So in the opening survey, the percentage for people that agreed with the resolution was 25%, 58% disagreed with the resolution, and 16% were undecided. And in the post-debate, 40% agreed with the resolution, 54% disagreed with the resolution, and there were only 6% undecided. So that's a 14% gain for the affirmative side. So the pro side is victorious in this. So congratulations to you all, and congratulations to everyone for participating. So thank you. And all right, so we'll go ahead and transition to our second debate, and this will be on the following foreign policy resolution. The United States hegemony on the global stage should be maintained. So if you could go ahead, follow the same process, and let me know if the text is wrong again.
Victoria, good microphone.
Yeah, no, that.
Okay.
All right, it seems like most people have gotten a chance to vote. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started, and it's my pleasure to introduce our second moderator for this evening, Victoria Marquez. Victoria is a rising senior at Harvard College, and where she is studying history and government, and she is from right around the corner in Reston, Virginia. So please join me in welcoming Victoria and our second debaters.
Thank you, Luis, for that introduction. And on the pro side, we have Matt Aldridge, a sophomore at the University of Georgia, along with Leonardo Moraveg, who is also a sophomore at Brown University. On the con side, we have Devin Moeller, who is a junior at the George Washington University, and James Carabino, who is a senior at Yale University. Welcome, everyone, and we'll start with 5 minutes on the pro side argument.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would just like to thank the academic programs team for setting up the debate tonight, all the work they put into making this program successful. I will be talking about general principles of U.S. foreign policy strategy, while my partner will be talking about regional issues and their specifics. Today, the global world order is shaped by an irrefutable truth observable to all in the United States and the international community alike, that the United States is, and has been for decades, the most powerful country in the history of humanity. The very fabric of the liberal world order is defined and presupposed upon American power, which shapes the very fabric of international relations and global conditions. We are the largest economy in the world, have the greatest geopolitical reach, and possess military capabilities unfathomable by our global rivals. Today, we defend this position in world affairs, one in which the United States is not the global policeman, but is the global leader. Our power is so deeply entrenched across the world that to alter this fundamental disposition is to violently denigrate a world order built upon the democratic peace ushered in by the United States. The United States is the only power with the military capability and willingness to defend the liberal world order. Our global reach is not a reflection of overextension, but rather an expression of our plenary capabilities. The United States military is currently present in over 75% of the world's countries, with approximately 660 to 900 military bases active throughout the world. The United States is the only country with an active presence in every major region in the world, and most importantly, the United States is the only country that exercises vast institutional military influence through its geopolitical control of NATO, the strongest military alliance on Earth. We are miles ahead of our closest rivals in terms of our capabilities. The United States ought to maintain this position because our democratic allies cannot. In Europe, the entirety of the EU only spends less than a third of the total US defense spending to protect an entire continent. In Asia, South Korea relies upon 28,000 deployed US troops and billions of dollars of arms sales. Japan is protected by 50,000 US troops and reliance upon our arms sales, of which Japan will purchase $240 billion worth by 2024. These defense measures, along with commitments to several other states, shape US global strategy. When planning our defense, we must focus first on the threats that currently exist. In Europe and Eurasia, Putin's Russian regime threatens international stability and the liberal world order. We have seen this with his 2014 invasion of the Ukrainian Crimea Peninsula, its bolstering of the Assad regime in Syria, and threatening posture towards Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In Asia, China continues to threaten regional stability and our strategic interests by constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea, thus challenging open trade, while simultaneously threatening our democratic allies in Hong Kong and Taiwan. The response of the negation, our opponents to these developments, is for the United States to end an era of primacy on the world stage and instead capitulate to Chinese and Russian spheres of influence. They ignore the potential of US power in doing so, as demonstrated by the fact that we forced Haiti's military junta to relinquish power, ended Serbian atrocities in Kosovo, and broke al-Qaeda's holdover in Afghanistan. Our efforts have consistently brought stability, security, while those of Russia and China would promote more violent revisionism devoid of liberty and freedom. When assertions of independence were made in Chechnya, it is estimated that over 100,000 civilians died as a result of Russian aggression. This pattern of authoritarian subjugation continues in the 21st century, with Russia supporting the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, who has repeatedly targeted his own people with chemical weapons. Likewise, a world of expanding Chinese influence is one in where democratic opposition is extinguished and the people are controlled by a massive surveillance state. At its most extreme, China has imprisoned over 1 million members of its Uyghur Muslim population into concentration camps to suppress the ethnic minority. Finally, outside of Russia and China, rogue states such as Iran and North Korea continually disrupt regional and international stability through the funding of terrorist organizations and the development of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. The United States is the only country on Earth that has the capability to deter these threats. This is irrefutable. To decline hegemony is to deny a liberal world order and to accept a violent transition wherein revisionist and rogue states hold greater influence over the world, naturally making the global order less safe and less free. A limited democratic peace limits our security and our prosperity throughout the world. Such a position is devoid of solvency that we should not accept. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll turn things over to Devin with the opening con statement.
I know all of you didn't have a choice in the matter, but thank you all for being here tonight. When the Berlin Wall fell, and with it the Iron Curtain in 1991, the United States emerged victorious in a bipolar power struggle that consumed American foreign policy throughout the 20th century. Between then and now, the U.S. has accomplished much in the sense of promoting democracy abroad, protecting the American homeland. However, the U.S. has also accumulated global enemies, incurred American casualties, and failed to strategically use key resources. Today, we will argue that the United States should not maintain hegemony and should instead move to develop more strategic and efficient foreign policies. We believe a hegemon to be a nation that has the strongest military and economic dominance on the international stage. To support an argument against maintaining U.S. hegemony, I will discuss how U.S. global interference has provoked aggression from foreign nations, how the U.S. has wasted billions of dollars in throwing around foreign aid as foreign policy, and later I will provide a superior alternative to hegemony. Later to continue, my partner James will discuss the domestic political concerns that arise from our overexertion of power, as well as the counterproductive results of U.S. military encroachment. Our first argument concerns how the U.S.'s hegemonic status has provoked foreign aggression. Why does the United States seem to be the enemy of so many aggressive states and extremist organizations? Well, to start, by asserting its influence and military power in various regions of the world, the U.S. has accumulated many global enemies. For example, many Islamic terrorist groups have targeted the U.S. homeland and American interests because of our historical meddling and military presence across the Middle East. Infamous founder of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was motivated greatly by his disdain for U.S. aid and support to Israel, the U.S. military footprint across the Middle East, and by what he believed was the American trend to support secular governance. Even today, 61% of Arabs living across the Middle East view U.S. foreign policy extremely negatively. Looking at another region of the world, in 2017, the United States found itself in an increasingly hot conflict with North Korea. But to many Americans, it was very unclear why the growing nuclear capabilities of North Korea were fixated solely on the United States. The source of these modern tensions between the U.S. and North Korea can be traced back to when President George W. Bush named North Korea as one of the 3 most dangerous states in his 2002 Axis of Evil speech. This speech, aimed at revving up support for the administration's counterterrorism mission, immediately created an unnecessarily tense relationship between our two nations. Moving on to my next point, I will now discuss how the U.S. has wasted billions of dollars through wasteful foreign aid projects. The U.S. has used foreign aid ever since the end of World War II to exert influence over the global order. While pumping high volumes of U.S. aid into developing countries has grown the U.S. global footprint, the lack of strategic spending has wasted billions and actually exacerbated some of the sufferings of the developing world. Studies have actually proven that governments receiving aid tend to slack off on their own domestic efforts to develop, and in turn, economic and domestic growth in receiving nations halt. If this is the case, why don't we pour this money into U.S. domestic poverty, our own infrastructure, or failing education system? Now let's discuss our alternative vision to U.S. hegemony that is more adept to U.S. interests. We are by no means arguing that the U.S. should become an isolationist nation. We simply believe that the U.S.'s hegemonic status is hindering American prosperity, and strategy must be applied to foreign policy. We need to be more targeted. The U.S. needs to adopt a paradigm that approaches world affairs from a non-interventionist viewpoint because, in reality, today the American people are demanding clearly defined standards when it comes to military action. Many have argued that we are seeing an emergent era of great power competition between the U.S., Russia, and China. Therefore, now more than ever, the U.S. must exert its dominance, some believe. However, this is absolutely false. Throughout the debate, we will hope to better outline how China and Russia will never be able to rise to the role of hegemon due to China's unstable demographics and Russia's stalling economy and inadequate military capabilities. Without the United States as the global hegemon, we envision that a movement towards collective action and mobilized allied partnerships is the way to go. Strong collective action is the answer to addressing major 21st century issues such as climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, while still balancing U.S. contributions. By adopting more strategic foreign policies and giving up the ideological myth of chasing hegemony, we can alleviate the burden placed on our nation to solely provide security for the entire globe, and as a result, we can focus our energies on bettering the lives of American people here at home. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll move on to Leonardo with the prose side.
Thank you, Victoria. It is with great concern that I advocate for us to continue on the correct and practical path of maintaining hegemony abroad. These past few years have been worrisome and troublesome because we have opposition in many forms, as entities continue to attempt to deter our influence abroad. The first main area that one must look at is the current and political power vacuums that not only necessitate our presence, but determine our trajectory as the current leading hegemon. The recent radical announcement of the removal of troops in Syria alarms not only the Kurds, our faithful allies, but also strategy makers that know very well that with the practical defeat of ISIS in the region, Syria has become a battleground for regional influence. The residual presence of 400 troops is simply not enough, as Kurdish forces that are backed by the US have been pushed out of their settlements by Turkish forces. Additionally, UN sanctions and political pressure have still not been enough to deter Assad, who depends heavily on Russia. With current stalled negotiations over a buffer zone and President Erdogan from Turkey pursuing an F-35 program, it becomes clear that the U.S. must continue its presence and influence to ensure that figures such as Assad and Erdogan do not determine the future of the region. Unfortunately, it's not only Syria where we witness these power vacuums. Ongoing rounds of peace negotiations with the Taliban have been troublesome for diplomats, as their proposed peace deal continues to conduct the same mistakes from the past. The Taliban have a long record of not keeping their peace promises and can't guarantee that they won't provide a safe haven for al-Qaeda members. We are currently negotiating the time frame of removing troops, but Afghani US-backed government and the officials are concerned that foreign powers do not allow them to join the negotiating table, simply because they are not recognized as the official government in the area. With competing interests, this more than ever calls for the US to solidify its current relationships and ensure that the region does not descend into chaos. When focusing on Russia, it's clear that they're not the same as they used to be as the USSR. However, history and foreign policy points that with growing unrest, economic sanctions from abroad, and a desperate desire to return to their sphere of influence from before, that they're more willing to take serious action. Putin administration still has substantial and extensive sway in important issues and continues to centralize power within the Russian Federation. With an expanding cyber unit sector, their continual support of Assad, the iron grip of trade within Central Asia, and opposition to NATO presence in Eastern Europe, it's obvious that our job is still not done in deterring Russian aggression. Finally, when we take a look at rising concerns in South Korea over North Korea's nuclear program, the encroachment of China on Taiwan and Hong Kong, and Chinese theft of U.S. intellectual property, we recognize that Xi Jinping desires to return to what he believes to be China's original and rightful position in the world, a view that not only did he diffuse within his political campaign, but continues to show within current meetings with President Putin of last week. We still possess strong relationships with our allies in the region, and we have a heavy military presence. It is our moral imperative to aid our allies in light of Chinese encroachment. These three regions highlighted are complicated, but our commitment and effort can surely continue our status of hegemony. While there are key differences from such examples, there are underlying similarities. Our allies and dependents deserve better. The U.S. still leads the free world. The creation of the global market through the institutions we influence has allowed for great benefits for consumers and entrepreneurs to conduct business and flourish socioeconomically. Whether it's the size of our GDP, the provision of human or physical capital, our dominance in funding of UN programs, our influence and reach with NATO, control of voting and funding in the World Bank, the capacity of our military, our faithful allies, or our sway of making of policies in the IMF, no country, not even China, surpasses us. While China is making relative progress in comparison to us, we must counter their growing influence and encroachment. We need to continue to preserve and protect the liberal free enterprise structure of the world, as it is obvious that countries do not desire to China to fill the role of the US, whether it be its horrible human rights record, the oppression of its own people, its encroachment of neighboring countries, and actions of espionage, sabotage, and stealing of intellectual property. They are simply not the country to carry this mantle. I hope all of you make the right decision and affirm this resolution. Our allies and our own people simply deserve better.
Thank you, Leonardo, and we'll move to James with the final opening argument.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Devin for illustrating the way that the U.S. has been provoking aggression overseas. And I'd really like to thank Matt and Leo for their youthful optimism about the future of the United States. They're sophomores, after all. So, unfortunately, we do not believe that the U.S. can maintain hegemony, and are proposing ways in which the world can still be an agreeable place after our inevitable decline. To be clear, what we're arguing is that the U.S. should cease being a global hegemon economically and militarily, not that it should become some isolationist backwater. We can still lead by example and be at the helm of international law and diplomacy. I'll now proceed to cover the domestic political concerns that arise from our overexertion of power, as well as the counterproductive results of our international military engagement. The first domestic concern of every American is to uphold our values. We have heard from liberal internationalists and neoconservatives alike that it's necessary to stand up for our democratic values abroad by funding overseas wars in support of them. Walter Russell Mead has famously identified these pro-interventionists as Wilsonian, since President Woodrow Wilson lobbied extensively for the national self-determination of peoples. But Wilson's idealism in 1918 came at a time when we had won the war to end all wars and naively believed that a century of peace would follow. The spread of democracy has been tried time and time again, and since the year 2000, two costly Middle Eastern wars have shown us to hold an illiberal disregard for state sovereignty. Moreover, a recent study by Renaissance Capital Bank showed that democracy only lasts in a nation
where GDP per capita is over $6,000 or else individual grievances will sow too much instability. Upholding our values is clearly undermined when our policies are illiberal and our methods are flawed. So what else are the primary domestic concerns of Americans? 73% of Americans polled last year by the Pew Research Center said that the top priority of President Trump and Congress should be to protect against domestic terrorism. Strangely enough, over 7,000 U.S. servicemen have been killed in the war on terror and counterterrorism operations globally, while just over 3,000 U.S. citizens have actually been killed by terrorists since the year 2000, almost all of those on 9/11. And here we move on to the ways in which international military engagement is counterproductive. It's clear that fighting in the war on terror is very counterproductive if it puts more U.S. lives at risk than it protects. A reaction to this counterproductivity has manifested itself in the foreign policy of the Trump administration, which Walter Russell Mead fits into the Jacksonian school, where Jacksonians believe in honoring alliance commitments but are not looking for opportunities for military interventions overseas and do not favor grandiose plans for nation building and global transformation. Now, this is not to say that Trump's policies are appeasing domestic political concerns or improving counterproductive military strategies, and we continue to see the annual defense budget approaching $700 billion. On the 4th of October 2017, Americans were shocked to learn that 4 U.S. soldiers were killed by terrorists in Tongo Tongo, Niger. But this begs the greater question, why were American troops in Niger in the first place? Now consider, for example, China's map of its regional defense command centers versus that of the United States. China has a map of how its military defends 5 different key regions of China. The United States, on the other hand, has a map of how its military defends 6 different key regions of the whole world, i.e. Africa Command, which obviously includes Niger, Indo-Pacific Command, Europe Command, etc. Our military strategies are once again counterproductive if people do not understand that such a neo-imperialist vision leads to global resentment. At least this anecdote has one positive takeaway. It shows that our largest competitor, China, still does not have even the institutions to start exerting power in the way that we have done since World War II. It is for this reason that we can withdraw from the world militarily without worrying about creating a power vacuum our competitors will fill. Now, my last words will be to propose a world order that sums up our vision for the future of the United States and how it will succeed without hegemony. These words are not taken from Donald Trump, not from a Republican, but from Barack Obama, addressing the 2014 graduating class at West Point. When issues of global concern do not pose a direct threat to the United States, when crises arise that stir our conscience or push the world in a more dangerous direction but do not directly threaten us, then the threshold for military action must be higher. We must mobilize allies and partners to take collective action. We have to broaden our tools to include diplomacy and development, sanctions and isolation, appeals to international law. This will be less likely to lead to costly mistakes.
Thank you to both sides for your opening statements. To put these policies into action and see how they would affect our U.S. military's response to things, I'd like to ask a question on the rising power of China, formed in 2 different ways for each side. For the pro side, I'd like to ask, 30% of Americans do believe that we should go to war with China if China invades Taiwan. So if you were to say that American hegemony should have a response to this, what would that response be, and should it go against American public opinion? And then to the con side, on a similar question, if the American military pulls back and makes its forces smaller in the region of Asia, should we respond if China were to invade Taiwan or undermine democracy in Taiwan and Hong Kong, as it is shown it is willing to do? So first, we'll go to the pro side.
Sure. So I'd first like to talk about the 30% statistic you used. That's assuming we're at the status quo right now where no U.S. service members are killed, and we're at a position where our interests don't seem directly threatened in the U.S. mindset. I don't think you can extrapolate that level of public support to a situation where China is literally combating against our own U.S. servicemen and women in the region. And second off, I think it's because of our hegemony, our large presence is the reason that China currently isn't shooting its guns at Taiwan right now. We act as a deterrent to any kind of expansionist Chinese threat, which is why we hopefully will never have to deal with this issue at all.
And then for the con side, would the pulling back of the American military have adverse effects in the Asia region?
First, to address Taiwan, when Americans were polled on whether they believed that the U.S. should exert military action in Taiwan if the People's Republic of China were to attack, 56% of people polled said no, and 63% said, "What is Taiwan?" So I think it is clear that we better need to reflect U.S. interests and the sentiments of the people. The reason why we are deterring China from invading Taiwan is because of our collective action and strong alliances in the Indo-Pacific, such as with Japan and South Korea. We currently have 50,000 military personnel stationed in Japan and about 28,000 stationed in South Korea. We also have a security alliance with Japan that says that if Japan were to be attacked or invaded, we would go to their aid. If these circumstances do arise and the evidence is presented, then by all means, the U.S. should go in to defend Taiwan and our allies.
If I could respond, by any means, you're supporting U.S. hegemony. You're saying that if China has a direct attack against our allies, we are obligated to respond. The United States is obligated to use its military resources to defend our allies. You talk about how many troops we have in South Korea and Japan. These are U.S. troops. These aren't collective action alliances. These regions are entirely reliant upon the United States of America.
I think you're confusing U.S. hegemony and just military presence abroad. U.S. hegemony is a school of thought. It's a way of being. It says that states answer to this power. They take military action, military direction from these states. Hegemony is a state of being. We are saying that the U.S. can still be actively involved in world affairs with the partnerships of our allies without being the one responsible for defending the entire world.
Just quickly, there's no consequential difference between that position and ours. Ours is hegemony, where we have a large presence and we are maintaining our strength with our allies by holding this unipolar vision of the world.
I guess I will ask for you all to respond to that point by saying, if hegemony means a strong military presence throughout the world, what would a change in our outlook look like? And specifically in your speech, James, you brought up Obama's larger threshold for military action. In Syria, Obama drew a red line and then proceeded to not cross it once that red line was crossed. What would the change in response be to issues like Syria and the Middle East if this hegemony change takes place?
Okay, well, in Syria, we were unable even to secure a no-fly zone there without the possibility of having to shoot down Russian jets. And I think this is a perfect example of how dangerous it can be to say that, we, in order to be a global hegemon, we need to, protect human rights, for example, in Syria at all costs, and risk ending up getting into a war with Russia because of some skirmish that happens on account of them. So I don't see why that necessarily has any bearing against our position on the resolution, particularly in Syria.
May I respond?
Yes.
James, the situation in Syria is much more complicated over that. I'm not going to focus on the skirmish because it's obvious to see that the region does necessitate our presence and hegemony. We are the only individuals within the area that have the logistical support, the equipment, but most importantly, the coalitions to intervene within the area. It's mainly because of us and our airstrikes that we were able to remove the chemical weapons that the Assad regime has. And it's also through the forces that we deploy and that we train through the Kurds that we've been able to push back in certain areas. But currently in the status quo, we see that there is a pushback by Assad and Erdogan. That, if anything, necessitates our presence. Other countries aren't present within the area, and they're not willing to take that mantle.
15 seconds to respond.
The consequence of what you just described, Leo, is that we are paying exorbitant amounts in American lives, American dollars, and we're putting a target on our back. So to suggest that we should assert our hegemony in this area of the world is suggesting that the United States should take the fall for all of international conflicts when, like you said, we do have strong coalitions in the area. Why not leverage these strong allied partnerships to better balance the costs that Americans have to pay?
I can respond to that very quickly.
We'll move on to the next question. On the note of intervention in the Middle East, in Devon's con speech, she brought up the point that U.S. presence in the region becomes a grievance that causes populations in the area to have a negative opinion of the U.S. and form groups against the U.S. What would you say to some of the negative consequences that have come about by U.S. presence in the region?
First, I do want to focus on the grievances themselves. It's unfortunate to see that there's casualties involved within our involvement in the area, but it's mainly been our presence that has also been a deterrent towards further escalation within the area. The only reason why Erdogan or Assad or any individual within the area hasn't seized complete power is because of our presence. If you focus on the Kurdish regional government in the northern part of the Syria, which is known as Rojava, you'll know very well that the area is quite stable, simply because of our provisions of not only foreign and development aid, but also military presence, equipment, and so on and so forth. It's unfortunate to see that there are consequences in certain actions, but when you're outweighing the benefits towards the cost, we need to continue within the region because no other actor is willing or has the moral imperative to continue in the region to ensure that the region does not fall into chaos.
And just to expand on that a little bit, there are some legitimate grievances and illegitimate grievances, such as those brought up by our opponents, where Al-Qaeda apparently has legitimate grievances against the United States, as brought up in their first constructive speech, where apparently because the United States exists, they have a right to hate us and commit terrorist attacks against us, and that we should be apologetic against this. That somehow Al-Qaeda has the same moral equivalency as other modern states on the world stage, and their grievances should be taken seriously.
To respond to the question of how terrorism affects the U.S. role in hegemony and in the Middle East, you have 2 minutes.
So yeah, we've already addressed the way that our presence there creates grievances, and we heard an answer that said, oh well, like that's unfortunate, but maybe it would otherwise also be bad. I would argue that that American hegemony is exactly what's causing all of the problems. Like without our aggressive support for Israel, without our quite aggressive approach towards Iran, like there wouldn't be all these factions operating within Syria like in the first place. And I mean, to say that our presence like in Syria would cause more terrorism, as as it may well do, I think there are so many other things operating here that it's.
There's a classic theory in international relations, realism, that I'm sure everybody or most people in this room are very familiar with. And realism states that as a state takes actions to secure its security, to project its hegemony, other states inherently feel more threatened. And this is what we're arguing here today. We are provoking aggression from foreign nations by trying to meddle in governance, throw regime change, and involve ourselves by overriding state sovereignty. This is what we're talking about when we talk about realism, when we talk about putting a target on our backs.
May I respond to that, Victoria?
Yes, and if you could hopefully respond to that in the context of U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, that would be helpful. We have 1 minute on the clock.
First and foremost, the coalitions and the relationships that we established in the region have been through our own will and initiative. No other country was willing to intervene within these areas in the past few years to the extent that we have. But most importantly, when you're focusing on Iraq and Afghanistan, you know very well that us pulling troops from the region and not being able to secure a peaceful transition is the main reason why that led to the rise of ISIS, as well as these power vacuums that I mentioned within my speech, which is quite crucial to take note because they seem to gloss over it. But when you take into consideration the position and the role that the United States has, it's clear that we do have this moral imperative and that we have to intervene in the region because there's detrimental consequences, not only to us, but to our allies within the region.
30 seconds response.
Okay, it is true that withdrawing from Iraq can lead to a power vacuum that creates ISIS, but withdrawing from Iraq can only happen if you enter Iraq in the first place. And I mean, there are so many other things that got screwed up in Iraq as a result of U.S. presence, including like the huge sectarian killings. So I don't know how else to respond.
And quickly to touch, you're bringing up morals and ethics. You're saying it's morally correct for the U.S. to waste our citizens' lives, to waste our dollars on protecting people abroad when we have real issues at home. So when we talk about morality, maybe we should think about the American people first.
So now we'll be turning towards the questioning side where you all will be questioning each other, and we'll begin with the con side questioning the pro side.
Okay, so we've just been talking about Afghanistan, for example. And Matt, in your opening speech, I think you somehow considered Afghanistan to be a success, regardless of the fact that we seem to be further than ever from undermining Taliban influence there. There's another issue at stake. So the war in Afghanistan resulted in a drastic increase in heroin production in Afghanistan, which supplies more than 90% of the world's heroin, which caused a quadruple in overdoses, with over 10,000 Americans dying from heroin as a direct result of the war. And this kind of thing in drug overdoses happen from other wars like Vietnam, Nicaragua, and Iraq. Do you think that these costs of international intervention are acceptable, frankly?
First off, I don't think you're showing a direct causal relationship between the externalities created in Afghanistan and U.S. drug policy back home. And second off, the Taliban no longer controls the provincial government of Afghanistan. The Taliban has been wiped away from most institutionalized governments and are in the shadow of what we have created through U.S. power, thereby increasing our security and stabilizing the region to a degree, obviously not to one that is satisfactory yet, but still one that is much more advantageous than another where terrorist organizations are constantly being sponsored by a rogue state that directly threaten the interests of the U.S. homeland.
To add on upon that, when you focus on the situation in Afghanistan, all you have to look at is the meeting of the World Economic Forum in January of this year, when Ghani, the current president of the Afghani government, stated that it's mainly the U.S. presence that has helped him to secure certain regions. And he is advocating for more U.S. leverage within the negotiating table, because the U.S. has been the only country that has been able to place the Taliban in the negotiating table in regards to this peace deal. But on top of that, it's mainly because of our presence and, once again, our support for the government that we've been able to secure certain regions of the country. So if you really want solvency, James, in regards to those issues that you bring up in regards to heroin production or other externalities, then it's obvious that it can only be through the U.S. because, quite frankly, in the status quo, we're the only country that has influence and heavy and significant presence within the area.
30 seconds response before the next question.
Okay, regardless of the effect on the Taliban, and I'd recommend talking to U.S. soldiers about how they think the Taliban is sort of responding to U.S. presence in the region. You still haven't addressed the fact that, it's basic laws of supply and demand. So Afghanistan supplies more than 90% of the world's heroin, and that has correlated directly, quadrupling in that has correlated directly with a quadrupling in deaths by heroin overdose back in the U.S. homeland. So do you think it's acceptable that this comes back home? It's not just an issue of security with the Taliban. These effects come back home.
I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I think you can stop illicit drug flows and still stop the Taliban. I don't think the response is let the Taliban keep ruling Afghanistan to stop heroin because our drug policies aren't good enough. I don't think our response is let a terrorist organization rule a country, terrorize its people, and pose a direct threat to the United States homeland.
If we could move on to the next question, you can ask the econ side.
I want to focus on foreign aid. It has been a substantial issue in regards to development, but has there been any reforms in regards to how the U.S., or more specifically USAID, which is a part of the Department of State, has dispersed such aid to certain regions of the world? And I would like to direct this question specifically towards Devin.
Yes, thank you. So at AEI, there's a scholar by the name of Dr. Jessica Triscoe-Darden who studies U.S. foreign aid and has developed a very interesting hypothesis linking what I described in my opening speech as the more U.S. aid that we pour into nations, it often halts domestic growth in these countries. The reason being is when we pour in 2017, $60 billion of U.S. aid into countries, it makes countries more corrupt, it makes them more lazy. So you see countries like Ghana, the Philippines, Ghana, for example, has a new policy that says we will no longer accept any types of foreign aid, especially aid from the United States. This is often because aid from the United States has different conditions, maybe human rights conditions, maybe they need to see a certain return on investment. But with U.S. aid specifically in these countries are recognizing that this aid is hindering their own development. So,
okay, I'd just like to add one thing, that this $60 billion, this could equate to a tripling in funding for medical research at the National Institute of Health or cutting national student debt by half, which Americans have consistently been shown to prefer. So I don't know how you'd respond to that.
May I respond?
Yes.
So there's two issues when it comes to military spending. First and foremost, it's mandatory spending. It's part of the budget that has to be set. It cannot be controlled. You cannot appropriate funding from one area to another. But now that that's out of the way, according to the World Bank, 3.2% of our GDP is spent in military spending, which is the lowest among decades. So this idea that we're spending more or that we're investing as much as they would like to say isn't the case whatsoever. But most importantly, USA statistics from the Council of Foreign Relations in their 2019 report show that 42% of all foreign aid, which is the largest percentage, is for long-term development. So this idea that we're just pouring billions of dollars into these areas is simply not true. But not to worry, I'll extend more of that in my rebuttal speech.
Just to follow up, just very quickly. I don't see how we achieve these solvent collective action solutions that you want to achieve by pulling out all U.S. foreign aid and showing our allies that we no longer want to contribute to their development and care mostly about our own internal issues on the world stage. I don't see how that creates a successful collective action program across the international community.
No one ever said that we're going to end U.S. foreign aid. our whole argument throughout this whole debate is that we're going to be more strategic with how we apply U.S. foreign aid and our foreign policy. We're arguing that the aid needs to be more targeted. It can't be just let's give them a check, good luck, develop. It needs to be specific in how we can actually help
You can
people.
still do that and be hegemonic.
Okay, and next question.
Okay, next question. Let's move the discussion to the Asian region now. You said one of the reasons why we must intervene in world affairs is because to our commitment to democracy and human rights issues. Does that mean that you support intervening in the Rakhine State in Myanmar? And if so, would you also support invading in Xinjiang province in China to protect the Uyghur Muslims? At what point do we draw the line?
I think that it's fairly difficult to intervene when there isn't a direct security threat posed to the United States. Obviously, we are acting in a manner that shows our posturing towards supporting human rights and these ideals that we hold truthful to ourselves and the rest of the liberal world order. That doesn't give us a blank check to go into Myanmar and recontrol their population. Hegemony is not a policy of rampant intervention, reckless foreign aid spending, and just overall inefficiency and carelessness. It's strategic policy planning to expand our influence on the world stage, to promote our security, and create a stable world order. I don't think those are in conflict with the two policies that you wish for us to address in China and Myanmar.
To add on upon that, if you want to focus on human rights issues, then it's obvious that it has to be the United States through its sway and influence, whether it be through the United Nations, through its funding, which is the largest provider of the United Nations High Council of Refugees, or through other institutions. The specific solvency that you seek within these areas can only be made through the U.S., as we do have the influence and the means to apply pressure to these states or specific actors or entities. But it's quite obvious to see that when we look at the influence or the presence that the U.S. has within these supranational organizations, that only we have that kind of sway to do so and not other countries.
Short response?
I'd like to say that I think Matt made our point really quite nicely, saying that we don't need to intervene if there's no direct security threat to the United States. I mean, it does seem to go against what they've been saying, though. You know, they talk about U.S. values and morals as much as we have, but they're arguing that we are a U.S. global hegemon, and I don't see how they can reconcile, like, going and supporting these values overseas if they're not willing to intervene in threats that they don't deem a direct security threat. I think that's the whole point of the argument.
Myanmar is not going to sponsor attacks against us. The Taliban has much greater proclivity to sponsor attacks against us. I don't think this is some cut and dry issue where we say, oh, this is a direct threat, we must take action. This is not a direct threat, we must absolve all responsibility. We're obviously looking at the broader picture into aggregating principles of what actually affects our security. Myanmar is not going to attack us.
But when we're talking about world conflicts like this and you're advocating for the U.S. as a hegemon is the one who intervenes in these conflicts. It's the one who's supposed to show the world the liberal order, the democracy, the right way. So we agree that that is very costly on lives, resources, and we would agree in that statement, but you seem to be arguing that we should. So where do you draw it?
Well, I do want to respond because there seems to be a major contradiction. If you're concerned about wasted resources by the U.S., you must know that the $50 billion that we spend by U.S. aid is under, by definition, by the Department of State, which does fall under defense spending. But on top of that, there's versatility when it comes to approaching these issues. Myanmar is a very different situation. We only highlighted certain key regions. We didn't highlight all the areas because, well, it is a 5-minute speech. But if you do want solvency within the area, then clearly it's the U.S. through its capacity, its means. But you're cherry-picking certain examples simply to highlight the flaws of the U.S., but you have to understand that those examples aren't the end-all, be-all examples of U.S. foreign policy. It's much more broad and it's much more extensive.
Last 30-second
I'll just
response.
say, the whole debate about what's be-all and end-all is acknowledging that we're not a global hegemon that can stand up for our values, without exception, and that's what I thought you'd be arguing.
There is more than one way to respond. It's not by sending the U.S. military everywhere where we think that there's a human rights violation.
It's actually their time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just to end, you keep bringing up how the U.S. is the only one who can police the international order. The U.S. is the only one who can intervene in these conflicts. However, that's because we've consistently shown the world that they don't need to do anything. The U.S. will take care of it. So by a little drawback, by adopting more strategic approaches, it'll signal to our allies that they need to step up and help us in this order.
With that, we will transition into the 2-minute break for the participants to prepare their closing statements. Thank you. everyone. If I could have your attention, we'll be restarting our closing statements. Hi, if you could please quiet down. Thank you. We'll be starting our closing statements with 2 minutes from each speaker, beginning with the pro side, and I'll turn it over to them for 2 minutes. Thank you.
The question of hegemony today is related to solvency, or which position will produce the greatest good in American foreign policy. We either maintain the most fundamental principles of the status quo and accept a unipolar world where the United States predominates for purposes of stability and security, or we reject the status quo. The negation has not provided a compelling argument for purposefully dismantling decades of American power built up over time. Our opponents' largest weaknesses is that they completely ignore that there is more than one way to intervene and control the international world order. Our institutional control of organizations across the globe give us a unique position on the world to control world affairs and intervene if necessary when we feel like our values or our strategic interests are threatened. Secondly, there is no viable alternative to U.S. presence. The EU, which only spends 1.3% of its total aggregate gross domestic product on defense spending, is not going to suddenly conjure up a collective action solution to make it capable of defending itself against Russia. The same is true in Asia, which is entirely dependent upon a U.S. presence. The only alternative to our opponent's position is increased Russian or Chinese presence throughout the world. There is no identifiable benefit rendered by this position. The reduced costs of limiting our influence are immediately supplanted by the additional security threats ushered in by our limited influence and by the fact that this would imply intentionally weaken the power that we have built up over time. By maintaining our vast control over global economic systems, international organizations, and institutional elements of the global world order, we have established primacy. Ending an era of hegemony would negate the decades we have spent building up our power, which allows us to provide the American people and the world at large with safety, comfort, and prosperity. There is no solvency in destroying such a condition. Thank you.
And thank you. We'll move over to the first con closing statement.
Thank you. Again, I would like to just make clear that rejecting this resolution by opposing a hegemonic United States, this is the logical first step in revamping an American foreign policy that reflects the people. In a 2018 CBS News poll, 60% of millennials believe that demonstrating military supremacy in international affairs was a flawed policy goal. Again, a March 2018 Pew Research Center study found that 78.8% of Americans would like to see a clearly defined set of goals to authorize military engagement. I personally believe that government's role is to reflect the will of the people. So when are we going to listen to them? To address concerns about China, China has an aging population that will still soon plateau and then rapidly decline. China is currently, by trends, unable to sustain its growing population and will in turn be very focused on its domestic concerns rather than taking over the world. I urge us all to think about what we are debating here today, whether adopting strategic policies that better reflect our goals is the answer. I urge you all to reject this resolution. Thank you.
And thank you. We'll move to the final pro closing statement.
It is of great concern to see that our allies and certain power vacuums have arisen to a situation where it necessitates our presence more than ever. There's 4 main reasons and why you should vote for the affirmation of this resolution. First and foremost, they were not able to address that there has been reforms to foreign aid and strategic making. Their bottom-up approaches have been used by the Department of State, something that they completely ignored within cross-examination. Second and most importantly, if you want to focus on partnerships and coalitions, it's important to point towards the fact that it was the United States that forged and created these coalitions and partnerships. But that most importantly, we are the country that not only funds them, but also provides them with the logistical and the capabilities to resolve many of these issues. Many of these other countries haven't been able to take up this moral imperative or mantle of solvency with many other regions. But thirdly, they haven't been able to resolve many of the power vacuums that do necessitate our intervention, because it's clear to see that these regions will descend into chaos, something that they weren't able to provide into specifics of how their broad coalition framework would be able to resolve these areas when these specific and exact same coalitions aren't even willing to intervene in the first place. But fourthly and most importantly, they cherry-pick examples of American failures to highlight that we should transition and give up the mantle of power, when it's clear that there's also many other examples that we've been able to fix our foreign policy. We have to be able to address our flaws and continue with such areas rather than completely backing from all the growth that we've been able to create through these institutions. If you vote for the affirmation in this resolution, not only will we continue our commitment to many of these countries that simply cannot defend themselves, but we will be willing to intervene in these regions and power vacuums that necessitate our presence as they will descend into chaos. But thirdly and most importantly, you will be siding with the side of the resolution that is not only most practical, but reflects the reality that there are many developed countries out there that simply are incapable or willing to take our position as a leading hegemon in the global stage. Thank you.
And we'll move to our final closing statement on the con side.
Thank you. To summarize, you must reject the resolution if you do not want the U.S. to provoke hostile nations through dangerous emboldenment tactics. Remember, we will lead in other ways, and our influence will continue to be felt. I just have one quick anecdote, which is that Hollywood, for example, the U.S. movie industry gets over 35% of its revenue from overseas, while China gets less than 1% of its revenue from overseas. And that's amazing when you consider the number of restrictions that China has on foreign movies coming in. Another issue that they brought up, which we never got around to addressing, Leo talked a lot about Russia and how much of a threat Russia is. And I mean, the notion that our allies in mainland Europe are beholden to us for military protection from Russia is absurd when considering that Russia is a rapidly declining power, got a GDP smaller than Italy's, and its defense spending is lower than France's. It currently has one aircraft carrier that is out of service. So, just kind of getting that on the table, I think that was a strange argument and finally got around to addressing. So overall, arguing that our hegemony should be maintained seems to imply that we have a choice in the matter. This is no longer the case, and aggressively trying to hold on to military and economic hegemony is at best wishful thinking, and at worst a very dangerous and provocative stance to take on the world stage. But this hardly forecasts a bleak future. The United States of America will always be a leader in ideas, will always exert a large influence on the people of the rest of the world, and will always be at the helm of a spectacular Western order. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the debaters.
All right, folks, you know the drill. New link is up there. There shouldn't be a typo this time, but do let me know if something seems off. And yeah. All right, it seems like we're calculating the votes. If you still haven't voted, please make sure to do so. All right, so the results are in. And the winner is La La Land. Thank you. I was too pleased with that joke. Thanks. All right, so for the opening survey, 47% of you agreed with the resolution, 33% of you disagreed with the resolution, and 20% of you were undecided. And for the closing debate, 63% agreed with the resolution, 30% disagreed with the resolution, and the undecided were down to 7%. So the winners again are the affirmative. So congratulations to you guys. And just a couple of things as we transition into closing the night. Logistical things for summer honors students. If you are in Professor Yu's course, you will be having class in the morning, boardroom at 9 a.m. If you are in Ms. Donnelly's course, you will be in the classroom at 9 a.m., heading out to your staff ride at 10:30. So please be sure to be there then. If you are in Dr. Strain's course, there's a group of you that's having a career session with Paige Wiley, and that'll be here at 10. And if you're in Mr. Orell's course, there's a career session also happening here at AEI at 10:30 a.m. If you have any questions, please make sure to head over and speak with your staff contact. Thank you so much for the guests that came here from Hertog, alumni, interns. Thank you all for being here. And really just another round of applause to our participants today. Thank you so much for all your work. And we'll see you in the morning. Thank you, folks.